I think that motivates us to keep moving, and our next conversation is, Bus, what did you call them, with the people who don't know anything? The people who do know something, because they live in communities that have experienced large-scale chemical contamination. And I want to invite folks who are part of our next panel to begin to move up to the front. And just to flag for us, we are really, in this conference, are using PBB and PFAS as kind of bookends for large-scale chemical contaminations. There are a number of others that have happened in Michigan, and we have representatives on the panel from Detroit who have experienced large-scale brownfield contaminations throughout the city, and I believe, is Yvonne Lewis here? From Flint, who can talk about the contamination of the water in Flint. I think I'm going to go round up Yvonne, and I'm going to turn it over to, thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Angela Reyes, who is the founding and executive director of Detroit Hispanic Development Corporation, who's going to moderate this next section. There she is.
Great. Thank you, Amy. I have the honor of moderating a panel of ordinary people who have done extraordinary things, and who have been living on the front lines with the results of large-scale contamination. So we're going to be having a discussion amongst the panelists, and then there'll be time for questions and answers afterwards. So let me just briefly give you the names of the folks who are on the panel, and then they will have an opportunity to introduce themselves a little bit more. So we have Teresa Landrum, who is a community activist from Southwest Detroit, from the zip code of 48217, which is the farthest southwest corner of the city, surrounded by a number of industrial sites, including Marathon. Edward Lorenz from the Pine River Superfund Citizens Task Force and Alma College. Tim Neyer from the PBB Citizens Advisory Board. Lawrence Reynolds from Flint was sick with an upper respiratory infection because it's going around. So Yvonne Lewis has gracefully agreed to step in at the last moment, who's going to, we told her, you live and breathe this stuff, you can fill in. And she is also from Flint, Michigan, is a community resident and the founder of the National Center for African American Health Consciousness. Donele Wilkins from the Green Door Initiative in Detroit, Michigan. Sandra Wynn-Stelt from Rockford, Michigan, a resident from there. So we have a very robust panel from across the state of Michigan who have experienced some of these issues firsthand. First I would like each of the panelists, maybe starting on the far end there, and to take a couple of minutes to talk a little bit more about yourself, how you got into this work, and some of the issues that your community has been facing around chemical contamination.
Okay, can you hear me? Hi, I'm Sandy. How did I get into this work? I accidentally backed into it, I think. My story is that I'm from Rockford, Michigan, little town north of Grand Rapids, and my husband and I moved there in '92 and bought what we thought was the perfect home. It was surrounded by Christmas trees. Who doesn't want to live in a Christmas tree farm? We lived there for almost 25 years. In 2016, my husband was diagnosed with stage 4 liver cancer and died 3 weeks later. And if any of you have lost someone, you know it's devastating. It's like trying to tie your shoes with one hand. You can't do it. But you kind of move forward. The next year, the DEQ came to my house and said, out of an abundance of caution, we would like to test your water for this thing called PFAS. And I thought, they're probably checking for Cheerios. I don't know what PFAS is. Knock yourself out. I'm kind of bored here. Come and test my water. And they came back about 3 weeks later, and I knew when they pulled in with a team of workers that it was probably not good, because I've worked in government long enough to know that if more than 3 show up at your door, they're not handing you the Publishers Clearinghouse. So They told me the rates in my groundwater at that time were 27,000 parts per trillion, and they thought that was an error because it was too high. So they tested again, and it came back at 38,000 parts per trillion. It's tested as high as 88,000 parts per trillion. My blood is tested at 5 million parts per trillion. I'm 750 times higher than the average person. That's not an award. You don't get a gold medal for that. It's just a fact of life. So when that happened, I met my neighbors, and I met my congressmen, and I figured out that this is insanity. We don't need to live like this. So that's my story.
Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Teresa Landrum. I am from a zip code 48217. We have been deemed the most polluted zip code in the state of Michigan. And that reason being because I live among more than 33 heavy polluting industry, and I live right down the street from the only oil refinery in the state of Michigan. I got involved in 1985 unknowingly when we in Southwest Detroit learned that the closed Detroit Salt Company was bought, and the new owners wanted to store toxic waste in the mine shafts of the salt mine. I was in the master mechanic department of General Motors at the time, and I heard about it. So I went and I asked questions, and people didn't even know that this was going to occur. It all resulted in me being one of 3 people to go before the Detroit City Council to ask why and how could they allow something like this to happen. Once they started to name some of the chemicals that would be stored in that mine shaft, it was just mind-blowing. And we live below the water table. We live in what they consider a flood zone, and we live on the side of the Rouge River, which you know has been named one of the most contaminated rivers in the state of Michigan, which is a tributary to the Detroit River, which is a tributary to St. Clair, Lake St. Clair, which is our freshwater source. So we were able to fight and tell them that salt was a corrosive once those chemicals were stored there, and if we had a rise in the water table and it flooded, that water could then leach into the Rouge River, which would go therefore to the Detroit River. And I want to say something about PBB. I first learned about PBB when there was the issue when the livestock was poisoned. Well, I also learned at that time that in the transformers that are on your light poles and in back of your house, that had PBB in it. Well, we in my community had a series of electrical fires where every transformer down one city block blew up, the stuff oozed out into the ground, and therefore contaminated our alleyway and our backyard. But unlike Sandy, no one came to our house. No one notified us. We were never tested. And just to move forward, I had become active. I was pushed, drugged, and rolled into the environmental justice movement. And so it was out of necessity because of the chemicals that we have been exposed to from surrounding industries. My area is in non-attainment for sulfur dioxide as well as ozone. So we started a community monitoring group, where we were one of the first communities to get a stationary monitor from then MDEQ. Because all the times we were telling MDEQ we're being exposed, we want a health impact assessment, we want a cancer cluster study, we want our blood tested, they told us there was no need for it. So listening to the stories today and watching the movie last night, this is the same thing that occurred to us 40 years ago that is still happening to this day. So that's how I became involved.
It's so hard to follow Teresa. Good morning, everyone. I'm Donele Wilkins, and I am the founder of a Detroit-based group called the Green Door Initiative. How did I get involved in this work? So, well over 30 years. ago, I was working in the space of occupational health and safety. And I like to say I'm a born advocate. Found myself working with labor and really became very motivated by the fact that people in my community really enjoyed retirement, and if they retired after working for many years in the most dangerous, low-paying work, their health failed. I'm also the daughter, my stepfather had worked for Chrysler, and he was in his early 30s. He's on his way from work after doing a long shift, and he has a massive heart attack on the way home. And as a result, he then ended up in a car accident, and that ultimately ended his life, which actually caused my family, my mother, to be a widow of 6 children and left her as a single mom. So fast forwarding, when I got involved in workplace health and safety stuff, it occurred to me that I needed to find out why my dad lost his life so early in his life, and which really led me to be approached by someone from this institution, Dr. Bunyan Bryant, who was familiar with my work because the focus was on Black workers' health and safety, and that was kind of rare back then. And he said, "You're the kind of person we need to attend this important meeting that's going to take place in Washington, D.C. in 1991, the first People of Color Environmental Leadership Conference." And it was the first time that a massive group of people from all over this country, including Alaska, Puerto Rico, Hawaii, the southern parts of this country, Savannah, Chicago, Detroit, Native Americans, all converged on Washington, D.C. to redefine the environmental movement, to really include people who had been sort of invisible in this work, particularly when it comes to exposure to toxins, and not being sort of involved in the policy-making processes that would protect their rights, to afford them the opportunity to have equal protection under the law when it comes to environmental protection. The number one reason for that was the color of our skin. And we have experienced too many deaths, too many deformities, too many things, as was mentioned even earlier, disparate impacts and whatever, because of the color of our skin, because of the racist policies, for discriminatory policies, for where polluting facilities and whatever would be located as a result of residential apartheid in our country. The color of your skin dictates where you get to live. And then too many times, like in the case of 48217, industry grows up around it. And until lives become something that everyone who enters this earth gets to enjoy, regardless of the zip code they live in, the color of their skin, the income level, until that is something that is ignored, that honors our personhood as human beings, I'm doing this fight for environmental justice to reverse that. So I've been working in that space for well over 30 years, trying to uplift this work. I'm excited about being in this room and in this space today, because as I also viewed that film yesterday and listened to the stories, I'm like, it's the same old story. We've been fighting it for a long time. And we've been fighting it by ourselves, and most people have just kind of said, oh, that's a Detroit issue, or those are Black people issues. That's not our issue. That doesn't reflect the environmental movement. That's not our issue. We're all human beings. And it's not okay that we can't breathe the same air, drink the same clean water, for our children to be in school buildings that are contaminated and have issues, to be located near freeways. There's a multitude of issues. How I got in this, I'm a born advocate, and it's my job. While I'm in this space, in this earth, I have to do what I can to speak my truth and to fight for it and to change laws. I'm looking forward to working with all of you across this state. It's about time we get it together and remove the false barriers, the false walls, like racism or whatever, and say we all deserve to have this quality of life.
Thank you, everyone. My name is Tim Neyer. I live near Mount Pleasant, Michigan, which is in Isabella County. I got involved in this some 46 years ago when I was 20 years old working on our farm. I think I'm the only one in our cohort that would be like the survivor of the atomic bomb when it dropped, and because our farm was the one it got quarantined, and all of our animals were taken, were tested. They had levels anywhere from 5 parts per million to 23, 26 parts per million. So every living animal on our farm had to be destroyed. And that happened on April 12th of 1975. The feed went out of that pallet mill that we bought out of Battle Creek in 1973 or 1974. So we got contaminated, I believe, at the onset of it. And so for like 18 months, we were milking our cows and shipping our milk to Everett Dairy, and they supplied all the Meyer stores in Michigan with fluid milk. Now, what it gets really complicated and mind-boggling was they quarantined us in April. That means no animal could leave the farm, nothing. However, they quarantined us for 2 weeks, and they came back, the Department of Agriculture, and said, well, you might not get a settlement right away, or, it might be a long time, and we know you don't have any money because, you can't sell your milk, but we're going to test your milk, and as long as it stays below 0.3 parts per million, you can sell your milk. So they temporarily let us milk our cows, sell the milk up until June 5th of 1975. That's when 8 trucks came there, and they had to wait until the milk truck pumped the milk off before they could back in and load the cattle up to take them up to the killing site. And I just thought, this can't be. I says, why are you, if the cattle aren't fit to eat, why are we allowing us to sell them? And the story was, well, we don't know about it, and this is such an unusual thing, and we don't know how to handle it, and we're just going by what information we have right now. That upset me. So from that point on, I collected every article on PBB. I went to every meeting that was around there. And Farm Bureau, where we bought our 412 dairy pallet, I don't think was forthcoming as much as they could, because when it came out in 74, we would go into the elevator and ask them, hey, did we get any of this feed that they're talking about? And the manager, oh no, that's just a small issue downstate. That's, you don't have to worry about or anything. And they kept feeding this line to us. So, what are you to believe? Until the state inspector from the milk plant came in and pulled your permit down. Then it got real serious. They we had to file a lawsuit in order to get a rapid escalation of our claims and stuff, and then of course we went through the whole process and stuff. And at the settlement they said, well, we asked them, what about our health? Oh, don't even bring that up. That's off the table. Nobody knows anything about it. It's not an issue, so don't even bring it up. You ain't gonna get a dime for it. So the state came in and had the Silikoff team come in. They came into Grand Rapids. My family enrolled in it. We went down there on a Saturday, and it was an all-day process. They took my blood and some fat tissue. I tested 1.2 parts per million in my fat tissue, and I had a half point parts per million in my blood. That was in 1976. Fast forwarded to, 2012, when you guys started it up. I get a letter from the advisory group, and I thought, wow, what a novice idea. We have a group of people that are actually getting together and seeing what you can do to get rid of the PBB in your body. You would go to the doctor and say that, to my local doctor, and they didn't know anything about it. They just tell me, oh, don't worry about it. So we got involved in that, and it just goes to show that as part of this thing, I always said there's one element that they don't measure, that you can't measure in parts per million, and that's the collateral damage that did to families. It caused divorce, it caused problems between families, between brothers. There's a lot of issues that nobody talks about that was an issue that never gets reported and never gets married or exposed. So I collected, like I said before, I collected all this information. I don't know how many pounds of information I had, but I donated it to CMU library. So if anybody wants to do any research with the actual articles and stuff that were written at the time and what was said then and stuff is at Central Michigan University for everybody to do research on, and I think that's the least I can do. So thank you.
I'm Ed. So I'm from Alma, St. Louis. We're sort of like the Twin Cities of Michigan, you know. I came here. I wasn't here when we had the PBB mistake. We lived in Chicago. I vaguely recall seeing on TV cattle getting shot, which was dramatic. But I came here in '89 to teach at Alma College, teach social history and public policy, and thought I'd be dealing with places like maybe Flint or Detroit, where it seemed to have a lot of social or economic problems, not Alma. We lived there a year, and in 1990, I went to a conference at MIT on problems in the American economy. And the first morning of this conference, I sat in the front corner chair, and the guy running the session came in and said, why don't we, before we start talking, why don't we go around and introduce ourselves? And he pointed at me, he said, why don't you say who you are, where you're from? I said my name, I'm from Alma, Michigan, and a guy in the middle of the group, the symposium, interrupted and said, if we want to study problems in the American economy, we had to go to this guy's hometown. And I was like, wait a minute, I didn't say Flint, where there were economic problems, clearly, or Detroit. And then he explained for about 10 minutes the history of Velsicol Chemical, the PBB incident, the total irresponsibility of the company, its terrible labor relations, and how it milked the economy for all this money. The owners went off and made fortunes. They left this devastation. Even knew a little of the story, and we saw, I think Michelle had a picture of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. If you don't know this, Velsicol Chemical, a month before Silent Spring was published, filed major legal claims against Houghton Mifflin, the publisher, because Silent Spring wasn't about just DDT. It was about a host of chemicals, including 5 that had been patented by Velsicol, andrin, dieldrin, heptachlorochlordane. So anyway, so I was like, this is really amazing. I live in this place, and so I came back, started a project with some students. I was sort of talking to people who had been involved, what was then 20 years earlier in the PBB incident. And as we did this in the mid-90s, we found out there were these just tragic stories, amazing stories of sort of failure of the policy process and all this. And then to make a long story short of my life in this, in 1997, EPA came back into town, having found how contaminated our river was with DDT. They offered to reopen remediation, which they started in 1998. And specifically related to health, because we had heard all these stories of people being concerned about the health consequences of exposure. One of the first things we did in 1999 was file, we were really at the edge of our competence, file a massive grant proposal to NIEHS, not to pick on NIEHS, it was different leadership at that time than more recently. We were turned down because we didn't have a community group to participate. And we were like, we're a community group, you know, but what they really were looking for was big name universities, not to pick on places, you know, some of you are from. They wanted those to be fun, to be doing proposals. They didn't want a community initiating this. And there was a question earlier about why has things changed? Well, things had changed already by then compared to the 70s. Michigan was much poorer as a state with the decline of the auto industry and other changes. And our health department had lost, on the state level, had lost both assets and personnel and money. And they had no interest in supporting our health study. It is so tragic we didn't do it. What we were proposing was to use infant blood spots, if you know about those, that are collected on newborns, and analyzed for exposures to PBB and DDT. And this was rejected by NIEHS, and then the state went ahead and destroyed the old records. And so we can't even do what we would have proposed, what we would have wanted to do at that time. So I guess I found out from all this, and it's a much longer story than what I'm just saying, how there really is a fundamental problem. There has been one in you know, dealing with these major issues. And one last thing, one observation that we made after a few years of fighting for this was, you know, there's this sort of environmental saying that you should think globally and act locally, okay? We decided that is opposite, that is wrong. What you have to do is think globally. So we got a problem in Escoto, we got a problem in, you know, Mount Pleasant, we have a problem in Flint. So get familiar with that. Become an expert on your local problem. But if you just hang on there and focus locally, you're going to be beaten by the forces way beyond you who don't want action and have much more assets. What you have to do is become experts on your local problem and then, you know, fight, you know, for an alliance across the board to confront this. And when you're thinking, it's not just geographically, it's especially economically. The economics of our policy is totally flawed. We are not assuming the costs of all the suffering from the endocrine disruptions, from the lost lives of the miscarriages. None of that gets factored into talking about the environmental problem, even the public health problem. So you have to think geographically across the board, but I think you also have to think about the economics, confront the economic model that justifies a lot of people suffering in the name of, well, we need it for growth, you know, and we say a lot more about that, but I better stop and give it a chance.
Good morning or good afternoon. My name is Yvonne Lewis, and I am a 40-year resident of Flint. But as I sat and listened earlier, thinking about the conversation at this panel and the question of when did I get started in this, probably got started in this at birth. I was born into a family of activists. I was actually born in Saginaw, Michigan, so the PBB conversation is very real to me because that was a part of my growing up and always concerned about what will the long-term impacts of this be. But I guess I would have to say 1987 was a pivotal point because I left 15 years as a salaried employee with General Motors to try to figure out what I could do to make a difference in my communities. That led me to begin working in partnership with faith communities. My dad was a pastor, and community organizations and academic partners. And so I really developed a passion to say, where are the voices that are missing from these tables? So I want to say this before I go too far and I forget, that the community voices are so very, very important. The lived experience brings a level of expertise that must be heard, which requires listening and being at the table, part of the conversation at the table, not just on the table as a matter of discussion and part of projects to get to solutions. The lived experience is critically important. So as I was sitting at the tables and I was listening to some of the conversations, I wondered often, who are we talking to? Or I said, who are they talking about? Because it didn't reflect the community that I lived in. It didn't reflect the people that I knew. It didn't reflect my lived experience. And so many years later, after many academic partnerships and conversations, the National Center for African American Health Consciousness was born, because in 1987 was my first exposure to anything public health as a profession. In 1987, I learned about Healthy People 2000. And then I learned about Healthy People 2010. And then in 2013, I was looking at the information about Healthy People 2020. And what I realized at that moment is that when I looked at the statistics and the data related to African American health and health outcomes, it didn't change very much at all, except for getting worse. And I attribute that to the importance of not really understanding what the data means. What does it really say? And then what do we learn from it? So I encourage, as we're having this conversation and I hear these wonderful voices, these partnerships are so extremely important. So we get to the water crisis in Flint. And it is not ended, it is not over, because for us, it will be a lifetime experience, much as what you've heard here. We wonder what will happen to the women of childbearing age. We don't understand what the implications of that will be. We talk about a lot the research that's going on and how this research is being conducted and what will it really mean to the residents. And I think it's important to have those voices at the table to determine the type of research that will be done and what are the questions that we want to have answered. So one of the things we did in Flint was we started the Healthy Flint Research Coordinating Center. That was our effort to bring community and academic partners together in an equal kind of way so we can all be a part of talking about what the research will be. You all know we had researchers coming from everywhere. And this isn't new to Flint. As you said, people have been wanting to come to Flint for a long time. So it isn't new to Flint. But the resistance of a community, when we were told that everything was okay, community members knew it wasn't okay and intentionally said it isn't okay and brought the evidence. But because they weren't considered, quote unquote, the expert or the scientist, the evidence was not received or accepted. But it was credible. The other thing is our Flint Center for Health Equity Solutions. This, again, is a community academic partnership where community members are at every part of the decision-making process. And when we talk about community engagement, I heard it spoken about earlier, community engagement. We know that in certain cases, community members might not be there at the beginning of the conversation, but it is important to consider how they can be involved and included in those conversations for the best or most optimal outcome for everybody involved. Speaking about, again, the Flint water crisis. It is so challenging to think every day. Not only are you having to figure out if you turn on the tap, can you use the water? There are other contaminants in the water than lead. Lead got us attention. And at times it feels like lead is also our Achilles heel. Because when we can regulate something, we can say we fixed it and everything is okay. But there's no safe lead level, right? But then you add that to PBB, and then you look around and now we have PFAS leaking into the river. We have multiple sites that are contaminated because General Motors did leave them. We are thankful that the requirement at the federal level during the bankruptcy caused them to put something together called the Racer Trust to help remediate those properties, but it's still there. And the residents have to face every day the question, what do we do to help ensure we do our best to prevent further complications and also mediate what's going on, and then what's it going to look like for our future. So this is a long-term conversation. We don't have enough time to talk about it all right now, but we welcome the opportunity to continue conversations, and I encourage you, for those of you that are really, really, and I know you are because you're here, interested in making a difference, just be sure you are engaging members who are living this experience in the conversations, so those nuances that you would never think about come forward so the change that's necessary can be made.
I told you they were extraordinary. So I'm a lifelong resident of Detroit as well, and live in Southwest Detroit in the zip code just adjacent to where Teresa lives. We recently had another contamination that happened on the riverfront where uranium and now PFAS is probably in the river just upstream from the water intake for our wastewater treatment plant. And we're being told that there is no effect on health, and the water is fine. So I'm wondering, with some of you folks, some of you have mentioned this, what kind of information were you given when the contamination occurred in your community about your health? And did they give you any advice on what you should do? From any of you who would like to start?
I'll take that one from,
Okay.
from my community perspective. Three things have been mentioned up here that have not been gone into. One is silos. It was just touched on. We have been working in silos across Michigan. Jane Keon and I were one of several people on a committee fighting to break down the silos of the MDEQ, because one hand over here is working on water, one is working on air, one is working on soil. None of them are talking. We have to change that culture. So when we asked the MDEQ to come in and look at the cumulative impact of what was happening to us from all these chemical companies, they didn't want to do it. We went to the Congress people in Washington, D.C. and talked to them, and it was as if they were so dismissive on cumulative impact. Nobody is looking at pollution on a cumulative impact, nor collectively across Michigan. Another thing that is so hard for me to get grasp on is that in my community, we have high rates of cancer that are off the charts. We had to do a White Cross campaign where we went to the people and we asked them to put a cross in their yard for everybody that had cancer, passed from cancer, or survived cancer. The news came out to cover it, and they were just astounded because one family, all 8, had cancer. My home, 3 of us had cancer. I'm a cancer survivor. My mother and father both died from lung cancer. On Miss Leonard's block, just a city block, 17 people. On my block alone, 12 people. That should tell you something is wrong. They sent the CDC in to do a study, and the CDC went back and said no impact. So what does that tell you? It tells you your life is nothing to them. We are casualties of industry's greed, and we know it. Ms. Wilkins touched on it. All these racisms is impacting all of this. Racism itself, social racism, economic racism, and environmental justice racism, all these isms are helping us to be siloed. We have to break it down. We have to come around full circle and realize what is happening in Ascota, it's happening in St. Louis, it's happening in Detroit, Michigan. We have a PFAS problem that they just connected right back to Marathon Oil Refinery, where PFAS just oozed out of the ground. 3 companies were responsible in 2018. In 2019, it was traced back to Marathon. Nobody has come to us and told us, do not roll through it, do not touch it. So there is a challenge with that. They don't even want to acknowledge it. The other thing I wanted to talk about was this: the doctors. Our doctors are not trained to identify environmentally related diseases. So when you say your doctor didn't know about PBB or PFAS, they probably are telling the truth. So this collected data has to be exposed to the medical field, and we have to demand that our Department of Health and Human Services, which is using our tax dollars, use our tax dollars to help us determine health impacts from industry. So we are being told, oh, there's no impact. Then we find out 2 or 3 years down the line, we have to file a lawsuit because they lied and lied and lied. And as we watched No Defense last night, the DOD, I wish we could just all get together and come together collectively and sue them about our health.
Thank you, Teresa. Ed, you were gonna, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Sandy?
Oh, well, I don't want to follow that. I mean, good grief. You give me some big shoes to follow here. You know, for us in Rockford, when they came to my house and said 38,000 parts per trillion, I said, is this dangerous? And they said, probably not. But then I noticed 2 people got out and started bringing in bottled water. And so I thought, well, probably so then. And we had to really fight to get people to acknowledge that there was some problems. They handed us the CDC sheet that anybody who's had any PFAS contamination has seen. That gives you stuff from the C8 study that says very clearly, we don't really know. But you have nothing to worry about because it's 2 drops in an Olympic-sized swimming pool. Which made me say, so you're saying 2 drops is okay, but 3 drops is dangerous? I'm not sleeping any better, if that's your analogy here. It was the same thing with us with industry. Wolverine Worldwide had dumped tannery waste at the Christmas tree farm in giant troughs and dug and dug and dumped truckload after truckload after truckload, and when it overflowed, they punched through the clay underlining so it would go into the aquifer, and then has contaminated a 25 square mile of my community. We had to fight to ask for blood testing. We only got blood testing when we got legal advice and went out on our own and got the blood testing that was awful. But we still struggle with doctors not knowing. So you, as the affected person, have to become the expert then with your doctors. You have to say, if you don't know, let me educate you. And if you don't know, then we're going to start looking for these things on the C8 study, just to make sure I'm okay. So I think we, as impacted citizens, are going to need to be the ones that help the medical community. We have to be the ones that work with researchers at Emory and at MSU and some of these others, and ask you to be our advocates, because they don't like to listen to us because we're not that smart. They assume. But they will listen to other researchers. So I need them to be our allies. So I see researchers going, I'm not so sure. So here's what I could tell you. We can be loud and you can be smart, and that's a dangerous combination.
I just want to make one point on what they said when they tell you that, 3 parts is not good and 2 parts is okay. That was the same scenario that they used with the PBB, where we could sell our milk as long as it was below 0.3, but if it was 0.31, it was a toxic substance. So it defies the logic of, and then your credibility in them goes right out the window. At least I didn't believe anything that they said after that. So my thought is it in there or it isn't in there? That's the levels or measurements that they should take from here on out.
Could I just say, just about Teresa's?
Yes.
I mean, or add, I think your
quickly.
concept about silos is so important for what we do because the silos make it hard to achieve anything. On the one hand, a basic silo we face is the environmental and public health division. So our site in St. Louis is primarily being worried about because of EPA. But there's this whole health consequences of much more concern to the people than cleaning up this old site, even though the site is a problem. But in a bigger way, our siloing that does us in is siloing economically. I've become sort of an amateur economist, I guess, because of this struggle, even though I have a book on that. But in any case, we have one version of economics that talks about we need economic growth. You know, we need jobs. Most of our communities in Michigan, in one way or another, are struggling with economic problems. So we want jobs. But we have that type of economics that just anybody who comes in and creates a job is good, whether they're making DDT or whatever. And then we have the other type of economics, which is we can't afford the cost of these cleanups because they're so astronomically expensive. And those two can't be allowed. They should not be allowed to be separated. You know, we know, for example, in our case, we've done a detailed study of the company's finance. That company never paid all its wages and all its taxes, never exceeded the $500 million we're now paying to clean up their mess. This is not economics, it's a lie. And worst of all, because we don't have enough money to clean it up, the other lie is we're making our kids and grandkids pay for cleaning this up because our federal government's running off a big deficit. We're not really paying even for the Superfund cleanup. It's, as Jane mentioned, we abolished the Superfund tax, so we're making our descendants pay for the profits, to talk about siloing again. We allowed the profits to go to the founders of places like Velsical. The guy became one of the richest men in Chicago, all this stuff. You can look it up. But the kids and grandkids are paying economically because we don't have enough money to pay for these, and their health consequences, who knows what the cost of those. So we have totally siloed economics, and we need to rebel against it.
Thank you. I think Linda wanted to make a comment. Maybe you can pass her the mic.
I just wanted to quickly go back to the 2 versus 3 ppm. You're absolutely right. The more we learn about loads of contaminants, there's no such thing as a safe level. There's no such thing as this threshold, certainly when you're talking about a population.
Let me just add that, you know, like for the PBB disaster, when we talk about parts per billion, which is like 1 drop in a swimming pool, not an Olympic swimming pool, but a regular swimming pool. But what's important to know is that your body's own hormones work at that concentration. This is not negligible. This is how your body's hormones work.
Thank you. Donele, you had something you wanted to add?
I think that I think it's important to even pinpoint, especially as we're going this afternoon to talk about strategies, that there is precedent. And while we're in Michigan, we're focused on the crises here in Michigan. But this is a national, and someone mentioned earlier, and an international issue. But there is precedent for making government and industry do the right thing. We've seen it through the environmental justice work all around this country, in the Deep South, along Cancer Alley, the petrochemical industry, and the impacts in other places. We've seen it when it comes to some of the international work at the climate change, the international conference of parties, and the research and stuff that's going forward, and all of that. What I want to say is that in order for us to really make an impact here, we don't have to reinvent the wheel to do it, number one. Number two, we can learn those lessons from what folks have set out to do, and some have achieved. And in our thinking going forward, let's not try to lift this up from like ground zero because we don't have to. There is precedent that we can learn from, and then we can take it to the next level. But the fact that we're in this room together, the fact that we're hearing each other and our hearts are open to this thing, we can do this in Michigan. And let's just do it, okay? Let's just do it.
I'd like to draw from what you said in terms of not reinventing the wheel. I'd just like to add to that we put context to it. Because some of the things that have been established to work in large-scale environments in one area may be good. However, there may be some contextual differences in those communities that need to be considered. And so, like in our community, we talk about what we were told to do. Many of our physicians didn't know what to tell pregnant women how to handle this whole lead thing. So we worked with our medical community, and they said to ensure that everyone with all these different conditions, if you're a senior, if you're immune compromised, if you're a child 0 to 6, if you're pregnant and breastfeeding, drink only bottled water purified by reverse osmosis. Now that's good in the conversation when you're having it, but how do we get that information to people who are actually living the experience? So a dual or multiple rollout needs to happen where there's continual conversation with community residents while these things are happening at a policy level, happening at a research level. What do people need to do every day to protect themselves and minimize the impact and understand the additional risk that they may be exposed to when they have these issues? And I would also like to encourage, how do we get past the exposure versus poison conversation? If, as was said, it is what it is. If you've been exposed and it's a poison, you've been poisoned.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for sharing all of your awesome stories and for also inspiring all of us to keep going in this work. Another round of applause, please.